As a youth leader or as a leader in a church, our job is to continue to be the minister, to continue to be the leader, no matter what happens, whether it's a death by cancer, a death by car accident, especially a death by suicide, which can take everybody to a whole nother place. Our job as the youth leaders, and even as a parent, is to continue to be that leader to all those people who are not prepared for that, who can't handle that emotionally.
During today's episode, we take a diversion from our normal conversation with Barbara Roberts, and we join Jonathan Lunsford as we talk about one of his hardest times as a youth pastor dealing with a teen suicide.
Really, the easiest way to do that is to maintain your relationship with God and let Him walk you through that process.
Please join us for this dialogue of dealing with the action. Remember, suicide is a preventable action.
As someone in the church who had a brother who died of suicide many years ago, this is a much-needed dialogue within the church. Much to my surprise, I found this, and I was shocked that there's actually Christians who are doing a productive dialogue about suicide prevention and how to help people with suicide and all that. So yes, I very much recommend this to anybody who is dealing with suicide or loved ones, particularly those within the church. Like I said, in a much needed dialogue within the church. So yeah, I recommend anybody listen to this.
The Ear, Evangelical and Reformed Christian Podcast. Welcome to The Ear, the Evangelical and Reformed, a Christian podcast that urges you to think deeper and draws you closer to God through faith. Through powerful sermons, teaching segments, and discussions, The Ear hopes to give you a different perspective on secular topics from a Christian worldview. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Please welcome your host, Brandon Queen.
Suicide is one of those things where we have an obligation to the victim to help them. We must recognize the sign. We must listen to them actively. And when we hear those trigger statements, like I can't take it anymore, or I can't do this anymore, we must act. We must act. We must do something. We must get them help. We don't want to get caught at their funeral twiddling our thumbs saying, what if? Or I should have, or I could have. Let's prevent this now. Listen closely. If you have a friend that is dealing with a suicidal thought, listen, and do something, for it is their life that is at stake. Good morning, podcast world, and welcome to yet another episode of The Ear. Today, we're going to take a little diversion from With Her Last Breath with Barbara Roberts, and we're going to join in with Jonathan Lunsford. And he has a very important story that needs to be heard that we're going to share, and we're going to talk about different ways of dealing with the issue or dealing with the action. So without further ado, please welcome Jonathan. Hey, Jonathan, how you doing?
I'm doing great.
Did I butcher your last name?
It's Lunsford, but
okay.
I don't know. No, my whole life has been butchered, so it's fun.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a minister. I'm 40 years old, been married for 20 years. I have 5 kids. I'm originally from the mountains of North Georgia, in western North Carolina, and then about 8 years ago, the Lord, asked us to move to Louisiana. So we're down here in Southwest Louisiana now. Working at church and stuff, not active in ministry as much at the moment, but I have been in the past, and so I'm just here working and raising kids.
Nice. Okay, well, that's fun. How old are your kids?
Oh man, the oldest one will be 15 next month, and the youngest one's just turned 5. So
awesome. Okay, all right. Well, we're going to be talking about dealing with the actions. All right. And your story is you were a youth pastor back at in Georgia.
Yes.
And you were part of you had a youth group of about 25 to 30 kids?
Yeah, about that. But at that time, yeah.
Okay.
It got bigger and smaller, you know how they do.
Yeah. Yeah. Inflation. But so you had one of your youth commit suicide. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the first question I'm going to ask you is, how is it being a youth pastor?
Well, it was, I would hope that everybody has a better experience than I did. It was tough. It's not easy because unlike being a pastor of a church, you're dealing with adults. With youth pastor, you're dealing with teenagers that then have to answer to adults. So there's a lot of challenges there. The parents don't necessarily want to do the things that, so it can be challenging. It is absolutely a blast. I love doing it. It was one of the coolest jobs I've ever had in my life. But it was sometimes a struggle dealing with the parents, and they kind of made it more challenging than it needed to be. But when it came to the teens and watching them grow and knowing that, of the core group that I have like 7 or 8 that are now preachers that are, and I have a bunch, not that I had anything to do with that, but I was just there to help facilitate. Some of them were, watched kids get saved, watched kids grow in the Lord. Some of them seminary. Some of them are doing amazing things right now. One of them is missionary in Mexico, pastors a church down there. And so it's great having been a part of their life. It's well worth it. Yeah, it's just challenging.
Yeah, I deal with the youth over. Excuse me. I deal with the youth down here at my church, and we're not as big as your youth group was, but just the different personalities that are within the youth group, which leads to my next question. Did you have multiple personalities in the youth group, or are they good, bad, or toxic?
Well, just like anything, you have the 4 main personality types. You can get into that conversation, but you have people who are outgoing. You have people who are reclusive. Some people are bossy, and some people will just do whatever you tell them to. We had those too. Where I'm from, there in North Georgia, there's a lot of people who move in, and retire there. So then their kids come, and then their grandkids come, and so a lot of our group was them kids. So we have a lot of the redneck kids, the mountain kids, the hillbillies, if you want to call it. And then we had a lot of the city kids and stuff. But for the most part, there was a lot of differences in their personality. But one of the things that we really, pushed for was that in serving people and worship, just it doesn't matter who you are. It's between God and you, And when you see somebody that's in full worship, and their hands are lifted and they're crying and they're talking to the Lord and the Lord's talking to them, and it doesn't matter where their background is, and they would see that, and it allowed them to get closer together because they both know that they're closer to God. So it was really interesting. But toxic, that goes back to the parents, honestly. That was the hardest part. I had one particular kid whose mom constantly threatened to take her kids away from the church because of the way that I was, and it was not me, it was the way they were, but it was just, the children themselves, no, toxic, but I did deal with some toxicity, but mostly from some of the parents. So.
Yeah, it's like that in most youth organizations. It's always the parents. I know.
Yeah, especially in Little League Baseball. Yeah,
I know firsthand with Boy Scouts, but
yeah, yes.
All right, so now I want to kind of shift gears, and I want to start talking about the teen that committed suicide. And who was the teen?
His name was Justin, and it was it's sort of hard to talk about sometimes, but I don't want to tell his last name because I haven't got permission. I was trying to get all his mom to say if it was okay to talk about this, but couldn't get a hold of her. So I'll just say his first name was Justin. He was from a divorced family. His dad was his dad lived in Michigan and they lived there in Georgia. His stepdad was amazing. His family unit there was awesome, but his father wasn't there. And his father kind of was one of them guys that had rejected him, by not being there. And although we tried constantly to to point out that he was loved and he wanted to be, that he wanted to be in church and he wanted to have that, but he had that inner conflict as why did my dad reject me? I don't know that was what it was. You know how divorce is. That's why I hate divorce so much.
Yeah, me too.
And so for him, he had that conflict, and he was extremely charismatic. He was an extremely good-looking kid, very popular, but there was still that inner struggle. And we saw it, and we prayed for him, and we prayed with him, and we spent a lot of time with him. And he was in and out of church. His mom and dad were Sunday morning only people. And so a lot of times it was hard for him to get to the Wednesday night services, which is where the teens really met. And when I was working doing construction at the time there in the area, I would occasionally go to his house and pick him up. And he would come to work with me during the summertime or off days of school, and we would work together and give him some money and give him a job just to kind of be with him and hang out with him. So I spent a lot of one-on-one time, more with him than any other kid in the group. But he was very charismatic. We didn't necessarily see the signs, but they were there, and we saw, of course, in hindsight, you see signs, but we didn't really see it. And I don't know how deep you want me to go in that just yet, but the whole ordeal that went down was very shocking. We didn't see that coming. We weren't prepared for that.
Yeah. What year did this happen?
Man, it's 10 years ago this January, which is kind of funny because we were talking, this coming January will be 10 years. So 2010. My wife and I were just discussing this the other day about doing something and bringing this to light and letting people know. And then it was really amazing that I ran into you on the Facebook page. So it all worked out.
Well, suicide is a very tough topic to talk about, very tough situation to deal with. And it's something that, everyone wishes they would never have to do, So now, you said he committed suicide in January of 2010. It's kind of a rough year for most teens during that time. I could remember we had some issues here with kids being bullied in school and stuff like that. But yeah, it's a tough thing. So overall, you said his behavior was very charismatic, but what was his behavior?
Yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, what was his behavior like with, adults and the youth?
He was the show-off kid. He was the one that would walk into a room and make jokes. And it didn't matter if it was an adult or a teenager, I'm not going to try to diagnose him, but it was almost as if he was flip a switch, maybe a little bipolar, where he was, he can get he get down, and then there was times that he was really active and outgoing. And as a teenager myself, remembering way back then, there was times that I was down, and there was times that I was more happy. And I think that we tend to look at, teenagers, especially with the hormones and with all the stuff that goes on, we tend to kind of look past it and think, oh, that's just them being teenagers. And unfortunately, that's something we have to be way more aware of today than it was even back in the 90s when I was his age. He was 17 when he died. Yeah. So yeah, he'd be 27. He just would have turned 27, I think, this last month, I believe. So
man, that's something the parents are never going to be able to get over. It's just such a horrible thing. Okay. Excuse me. So how do you as a youth pastor, deal with this kind of information? Like once you got the information, how did you, I guess, process it?
Well, I always kind of feel like I did it wrong, because I didn't cry at first. It was kind of weird. It's hard to explain that to people, but I was working in a factory in Franklin, North Carolina, which was just like a half-hour drive. I was headed to work. I was working the graveyard shift, and I was headed to work one night, and his grandmother, who's a member of the church, so a good friend of